my background or my focus is of course in entrepreneurship. I would say also innovation management and strategy, technology strategy to some extent, but primarily in entrepreneurship. So my examples might have a bit of a tilt towards entrepreneurship, but I'm trying to frame it at least initially as generally as I can. So the question then is, what is design science and how can it be understood? I'll start, as I said, by a more general introduction and then focus a bit more on how this, can add value in the field of entrepreneurship. And if I have time towards the end, I'll mention the journal. So you have to stop me if I'm going over time, because then I'll cut that piece out. The thing with design is that, and design science is that it's something that can be positioned in relation to a more kind of what you might call natural science oriented type of research, more descriptive, more explanatory, describing natural phenomena, natural entities in the world, as opposed to designing artifacts. And artifacts are, of course, defined by their kind of man-made kind of characteristics. And as Christoph was alluding to, much of the kind of thinking around this boils down to or harks back to Herbert Simon's work. There are lots of design theorists, as design people will often remind one, from Schoen and going back to the pragmatists and everything, who of course inspired Simon. But much of it in the management field, I would say, is grounded in Simon's work. So that's my point of departure here as well.
Henrik, sorry to interrupt you there in this case, but I just forgot something, that we will also, of course, have the time to have Q&A after the presentations. So if there are any things within the presentation that you would like to dig deeper into, then you can keep them for the Q&A, and after each presentation, we will have about 10 minutes for a Q&A session.
Yeah, absolutely. So any questions, put them in the chat and we'll discuss them afterwards. So natural things and designed artifacts are quite different. And to use Simon's terminology, he said that the natural sciences, which in his term does not only mean like the traditional sciences, but also more social science that aims to describe the world in its kind of natural state, describe it as it is and explain it as it is. So natural sciences are concerned with how things are, whereas design, on the other hand, is concerned with how things ought to be, about devising artifacts in order to attain particular goals, right? So a natural scientist might study iron and its properties and how frequently it occurs in nature, etc. Whereas a designer will design some sort of artifact in order to achieve a kind of purpose. And that's the main distinction. And natural phenomena then, of course, have a sort of inevitability about them, a necessity about them. They exist in order because they follow the natural laws, and that's how we can explain them and understand them, as opposed to artificial phenomena, designed artifacts, which have an air of contingency. They are the way they are because they exist for a purpose within a particular context in a specific environment. So a mountain looks the way it does because it's been shaped by forces of nature that we can understand using various laws. Whereas, this fortification, this mountaintop, I guess somewhere in the Alps or northern Italy or something like that, looks the way it does because, people wanted to perhaps defend it, the mountain. They perhaps wanted to look aesthetically pleasing. They had certain materials around. So those contingencies and those goals helped shape the artifact. And as such, it's quite different from the natural entities, which are more kind of inevitable, to use Herbert Simon's phrase. So artifacts can then actually be described as an interface, a meeting point between the inner environment, the substance that it's made out of, the organization of the artifact, and the outer environment. So as artifact, it is an interface between the internal context and the external context, the internal environment and the external environment. To use an example, a classical example, when the British, or the English rather, had this big prize, this big award for constructing a clock that could keep time on ships that were kind of rolling around on the oceans in the 18th century. The clock as a functioning device to keep time on a ship could not be made the same way as it was on land. So the clock as an artifact is not the kind of things that it's made up of. It's its ability to kind of have an internal organization that achieves a particular function in light of an external circumstance. So a clock on a ship has to be designed internally in such a way that it can fulfill its function in the context of a ship that's rolling on the ocean. And the same thing with the knife example that I used before. Let me see. Does it want to skip? Yeah. So whether a knife will, fulfill its function of cutting, depends on the material of the blade, what it's made out of, but also the substance which it's applied. So sometimes you can make a knife out of wood if that's enough to fulfill the purpose of, for instance, cutting butter in the morning to spread on your piece of toast. So it's the fit with the kind of external conditions, the external requirements, and the material or organization of its internal parts, so to speak, in light of a given purpose. So the question then is, if all of this is so contingent, if everything about an artifact is contingent on all these things, what can we do? Can we create a science out of it? Is there anything, Simon asks rhetorically, besides the kind of boundary sciences? The external natural environment, the internal natural environment, the carbon and the steel of the knife, the qualities of the butter or the flesh to be cut. Is there anything scientifically to be said about the actual designing of artifacts? Well, one way to think of it is in terms of design principles, technical norms, as the old philosopher Henrik von Fricht called it. So if you then again go back to separating between natural and artificial sciences, a natural scientist might ask, okay, what are the kind of causal mechanisms connecting this thing to the other? X causes Y in situation B. This is the type of explanation that one typically wants if one is in this more natural science idiom. This is, of course, very tricky if it's very complex and contingent. You can't find these like very stable correlations and explanations. So instead, what you aim for is more like a design principle. To achieve A in situation B, something like X will help. I think this is von Fricht's formulation. Not this natural science kind of causal mechanisms, but more useful pragmatic heuristics. In entrepreneurship, we have, of course, in the practitioner realm, the lean startup and similar books and theories that espouse principles, and of course also Sarasvati's theory of effectuation, which is a set of heuristics, design principles that are pragmatic and achieve certain goals. And some colleagues from Chalmers, my university, have produced, I think, the most widely used life cycle analysis handbook, which is also a set of principles and tools for actually conducting life cycle analysis, not algorithmically, not stable correlations or anything, but useful design principles. And I really like, I put together this little clip with Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who talks about this phenomenon. So if we have a few minutes, I'd like to play a short clip by Elinor here. So
everyone pushed me for, oh, let's get some.
You hear the sound, right?
What kind of market rules will work?
Right.
What kind of bureaucratic rule? I mean, they wanted simplest, and I kept reading, and we couldn't come up with simple answers.
Right.
And I just got desperate, and because I was identifying this kind of, was it all that they used 3/4 rules? Was it majority? Did they have to have a leader? And I couldn't find any of these statistically significant. So that's when I went up a level and said, well, can I get kind of some of the commonalities and that I then ended up calling design principles. So why were some successful, and then why were some failures?
Right.
And did those design principles count for anything? And I put them out because that was as good as I could do. And fortunately, they've been quite sustainable. There's now a study of 110 systems or so that are articles that have evaluated them, and a very large number of case studies, and they seem to be pretty robust. Not perfect, but robust. but I didn't come up with a decision rule. I said that people
Right.
had to be able to make some of their own rules and then adapt them over time.
Right.
And that's what's so
The
important.
adaptation was also very
Really
yeah.
important. And people keep wanting the formula. And if anything, if I want one lesson, is there's no ideal formula for
Right.
all of these things. Think how different they are.
Well, and you also imply that it depends what the problem is, at what level of government.
Yeah, and
It's
some things need
solved.
national.
Right.
Some things need global.
Right.
Some things need very,
Very local.
yeah, and
right.
some things don't need to be government at all.
Right. Or governed.
Everyone pushed me.
Yeah. So just an illustration of you know, I don't think Ostrom was you know, well versed in Simon or design science, but she came up against this kind of conundrum. Okay, I can't find these stable correlations. I can't find these causal mechanisms. I only find these patterns. I see these principles seem to be useful, and of course Ostrom formulated them in terms of her, I think there are 8 kind of design principles for common pool resource management that are then usefully applied in various contexts and adapted to local circumstances in order to actually manage those resource pools. So a science of design can it be formulated? Sure, and you can conduct this type of research and formulate these types of principles and meta theories, and you can win Nobel Prizes in economics. So you know, it's not just kind of practical technical problem solving, but it's actually something that lots of people would consider, you know, proper science. I'm not sure about time here, Christoph. Can you help me out?
Yeah,
About
so
30
we still-
minutes.
Yeah.
So I have like a few minutes left. Yeah. So I'll skip the entrepreneurship part then and just focus on the abstract general stuff then. So to place design science a bit more in context and deepen that context to other kind of paradigms or modes of doing research, this is a kind of graph I actually stole from one of George's papers. I think it's in Org Science. So where you can compare design science to, it says science here, but you know, more this kind of natural science type research and the type of research that is conducted in the humanistic disciplines. So in design, knowledge is pragmatic, prescriptive. It's in order to accomplish certain things. The kind of more traditional explanatory and descriptive sciences, you know, has more of a correspondence epistemology. You know, knowledge represents reality, whereas in the humanities, it's more socially constructed, right? So if you relate these things to Herbert Simon's discussion here of artifacts as interfaces connecting inner and outer environments to achieve certain purposes, I think you can fruitfully connect these things to one another, right? So you can think of knowledge representing reality. Is it true? You know, it has a truth value. That's something that you can apply to the inner and the outer environment. Typically, that can be described in this context, in this way. Design science is more about the actual interface and if it's appropriate. You know, does it work? Is it effective? Are these, you know, heuristics for life cycle assessment, are they useful? Are they appropriate in light of what we know about inner and outer environments? And the actual question of purpose is more a question for the humanities. You know, is this a worthy goal, a useful goal, for instance? So if we take how an example of how this might play out in with a particular phenomenon, take modern industrial chicken farming. You know, you can ask questions from a natural science perspective. You know, and you can answer questions about chicken metabolism, nutritional science, demography and market research to understand future demand, etc. More descriptive, truth-oriented type of knowledge. Design science research would be more about operations analysis, financial optimization, business model design, organization design. You know, those are more design-oriented kind of knowledge that could be useful in this context. And the humanities might ask questions. You know, what is a worthy life? And is it morally defensible to actually treat sentient beings in this way? And as you can see, these are quite different domains. And I think this places design in a context that makes its contribution and its purpose a bit more clear. So I was going to say a few things about entrepreneurship and design and you know, a bit more about the journal as well. But I think I'll skip those parts and because I showed that video, which I didn't plan to do. But I want to mention the journal though. So we have a new journal in the entrepreneurship field, a sister journal to Journal of Business Venturing, focusing on design. And It has a great reviewer editorial review board. Many of the people that you will hear from here today, and several others as well. So if you do research in the entrepreneurship field in this domain, feel free to send us a manuscript. So with that, I think I'll stop.